The year was 1945. Across the verdant slopes of southern Bavaria, the nascent sunlight of spring cast hesitant rays upon a landscape that seemed to have forgotten its very identity. Officially, the war had concluded, or so the victorious headlines proclaimed. Yet, for those still slogging through the visceral mud of a nation brought to its knees, the conflict remained acutely present. It had merely transmuted its form. No longer did the roar of distant battles tear through the heavens or the echoes of artillery reverberate from mountain peaks. Instead, it settled into a profound, chilling silence, mirrored in the vacant gaze of women whose once unwavering faith in their country's invincibility had utterly collapsed. Through the winding, intimate arteries of the Bavarian countryside, where the air hung heavy with the damp scent of new hay and the lingering acridity of spent smoke, convoys of trucks emblazoned with the stark white star of the Allied forces made their deliberate passage. From field edges, stoic farmers, their faces etched with wariness, rested against weathered fence posts, observing the seemingly endless procession of exhausted visages. These were women, nurses whose hands had tended wounds, telephone clerks who had connected desperate voices, widows now adrift, and daughters whose futures had been abruptly rescripted. All, regardless of their past lives, were now unequivocally classified as prisoners. Clutching thin blankets and worn canvas satchels, the paltry remnants of their former existences, they journeyed toward an uncertain fate. Among them, some were barely out of girlhood, having known nothing but the totalitarian grip of Hitler's Reich. Others carried fading memories of a gentler Germany, a time when strudel evoked the warmth of a Sunday treat, rather than the stark, desperate struggle for sheer survival. The American internment camp, situated in the pastoral environs near Garmisch, defied the grim expectations of a wartime prison. It was startlingly organized, strangely polite, almost unnervingly pristine. The wire fences, recently erected, gleamed with an almost silver luminescence in the fresh light of spring. The guards, young men really, their uniforms pressed and sleeves rolled, conversed with a casual, unsettling friendliness. One German nurse, barely 23, confided in a hushed whisper that the Americans smiled with disarming ease, as if they somehow failed to grasp the profound solemnity of their victory. She would later confess, "It was their composure that terrified us most. They behaved as though the world had already irrevocably moved forward." Within the camp's boundaries, a new routine took shape, a rhythm both alien and eerily familiar. Mornings commenced with inspections, followed by the predictable distributions of meager rations and occasional medical examinations. The same clipped English phrases were broadcast through tinny loudspeakers, echoing across the compound. "Please remain in line. Breakfast at 0700. The women feigned indifference, pretending not to listen, though many would secretly mouth the unfamiliar words when unobserved, a quiet rebellion of self-preservation. Beneath the layers of humiliation, a flicker of curiosity began to stir. Who were these conquerors who extended blankets, offered cigarettes, and even shared fleeting smiles, rather than the expected vengeance? For the Americans, the camp represented a solemn duty, not a triumphant act of retribution. Many of the soldiers and cooks had been ordinary civilians mere months prior. Farmers, mechanics, bakers, and waiters plucked from their everyday lives and thrust into a war they barely comprehended. Corporal James Hanley of Chicago, for instance, had once worked in his father's bustling bakery on Halsted Street. His particular gift was for apple pie, though he had also mastered the art of strudel, taught to him by a German immigrant who owned the shop next door. When Hanley was drafted, he carried that cherished recipe with him, scrawled on a grease-stained index card, carefully folded inside his Bible. Now, in this Bavarian camp, surrounded by the spectral remnants of a fallen Reich, he found himself kneading dough once more, though this time beneath a very different flag. To the German women, the notion of an American baking strudel verged on sacrilege, a cultural offense. They spoke of it in furtive whispers behind the barracks, their tones a complex blend of wounded pride and incredulous disbelief. "Strudel is ours," one woman declared, her arms tightly folded, as if guarding the very essence of the pastry. "They can make meatloaf and hamburgers, but Apfelstrudel, that is the German soul." Another scoffed, asserting that the Americans likely filled it with canned fruit and sugary water, just as they adulterated their coffee with cream. Even brittle, frost-like laughter briefly punctuated their despair. In the throes of their profound defeat, pride had become their final, desperate defense. Outside, the air carried the faint, interwoven sense of nascent spring and cold, residual smoke. The snowmelt, coursing through the villages, brought with it a mournful debris, fragments of uniforms, shards of shattered glass, a child's doll with vacant, missing eyes. The women had learned to avert their gaze, to stop scrutinizing too closely what floated past. Their world had been systematically dismantled piece by agonizing piece. First by the indiscriminate terror of bombs, then by the stark finality of surrender, and now by the peculiar, unsettling mercy of their captors. Mercy, they were discovering, possessed its own insidious capacity to wound. It compelled them to confront the humanity of their enemy, a truth far more arduous to bear than hatred. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, casting a molten gold sheen over the barbed wire, an ineffable aroma wafted across the entire camp. It was sweet, profoundly buttery, alive with the warm embrace of cinnamon. Heads turned instinctively toward the kitchen block, an unspoken question in every gaze. For a few suspended seconds, even the guards paused their patrols, drawing in the air with faint, involuntary smiles. A German woman murmured, her voice barely a breath, "That smell! It cannot be." Another whispered, with a dawning sense of revelation, "It is strudel." The word rippled through the line of women like a sudden tremor. They craned their necks, desperate for confirmation. Through an open doorway, they could glimpse American soldiers in white aprons, laughing, skillfully rolling dough, brushing it with melted butter. The sight stung a sharp, unexpected pain. How dare they? How could the same hands that had wielded rifles also fold pastry with such unexpected tenderness? A few women turned away in overt disgust. Others felt something far more dangerous, far more primal, hunger. Inside the bustling kitchen, Corporal Hanley worked with quiet concentration. His sleeves were rolled high to his elbows, his strong hands dusted white with flour. He wasn't contemplating symbolism or the complexities of geopolitics. His sole focus was on achieving the perfect dough, thin enough to discern a letter through. The sergeant beside him chuckled, a dry joke. Guess we're teaching them democracy through dessert. Hanley offered only a slight smile. "Maybe," he replied softly, "or maybe we're just feeding people who've forgotten what warm, comforting food truly tastes like." That night, the rumor solidified into a camp legend. The Americans were preparing apple strudel for their prisoners. Some dismissed it as cynical propaganda. Others prayed fervently that it might be true. The following morning, as the women formed their usual line for rations, boiled potatoes, dry bread, and a ladle of thin soup, they caught sight of something entirely new on the tray line. Steam curled delicately from rows of golden pastries, their edges crisp and glistening, the aroma so rich and intoxicating it almost hurt to breathe. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved, a collective silence falling over the compound. Even the guards seemed to hesitate, keenly aware that something profoundly delicate was unfolding. A sergeant eventually called out the ration count. The first woman stepped forward, a barely perceptible tremor in her movements. She looked down at the strudel nestled on her tin plate, then up at the young soldier who handed it to her. He smiled, not with mockery, but gently, as if extending an offering of peace. She did not return the smile. She simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible gesture, and carried it to her bench. When she cut into it, The pastry flaked cleanly, yielding with a soft whisper. The apples within were tender but not soggy, subtly brightened with lemon, and spiced just enough to awaken dormant memories. She tasted, and in that moment the world tilted, ever so slightly. It was impossibly, achingly perfect. Around her, others followed suit. The first sound was not one of overt approval, but rather a profound silence, the kind that descends when stubborn pride unexpectedly confronts an undeniable truth. Then someone laughed quietly, as if caught off guard and slightly embarrassed. Someone else muttered, "Impossible." But soon, even the most resistant among them found themselves devouring every last crumb. Later that night, a nurse recorded in her confiscated diary, "They make it better than we do, and I hate them for it, but also, I don't." The next day, whispers spread once more, not of politics or capitulation, but of recipes. The war had incinerated entire cities, scarring the land and its people. Yet somehow, in this fenced corner of Bavaria, it had also, against all odds, baked an unexpected kind of peace. And still, beneath the gentle sweetness of that remarkable discovery, a nagging question lingered. If the Americans could master the very soul of German comfort, what else might they reconstruct or remake in their own image? The answer, as the women would soon learn, would emanate not from the thundering guns of victory, but from the quiet, redemptive kitchens of mercy. The mornings in the camp began with the familiar clang of tin cups and the rasp of boots on gravel. Mist hung low over the barracks, softening the stark edges of the wire fences, rendering them ghostly and ephemeral. The women awoke to the same dull hunger, the same metallic taste of fear that persistently refused to dissipate, and lined up for breakfast under the vigilant eyes of the guards. The air carried the faint sense of smoke and soap, now mingled with something they could not yet quite name, something warm, rich, and distinctly foreign drifting from the kitchen block. For a fleeting moment, the women forgot their shame long enough to wonder what could possibly smell so utterly delicious in a place designed for punishment. Inside the kitchen, life pulsated to a fundamentally different rhythm. The cheerful clang of ladles, the rhythmic hiss of steam, the hushed jokes exchanged between soldiers. These had replaced the barking of orders and the crack of gunfire that had dominated the preceding months. It was a strange, poignant irony of war. Some men who had once carried rifles now deftly wielded rolling pins. Corporal James Hanley had discovered his post-war identity at a flour-dusted counter, sleeves rolled, apron tied somewhat crookedly, his once battle-hardened hands now steadily guiding a wooden spoon instead of a weapon. He wasn't sure whether to feel shame for this new role or profound relief. The army had trained him to destroy. Now it demanded he nourish those it had conquered. Behind him, Sergeant Peters called out from the pantry, a note of skepticism in his voice. "Hanley, you sure about this? These women probably think cinnamon's a war crime." Hanley chuckled under his breath. "Maybe," he replied, a wry smile touching his lips. "But it's all we've got left to fight with." The humor, however, veiled something deeper, an unspoken discomfort with the idea that kindness might now be their most potent weapon. He meticulously measured sugar into a large pot, added water, and watched it dissolve, the evolving scent of caramel and apples beginning to thicken the air. Every careful swirl of the spoon felt like a small, defiant act of rebellion against the brutality the world had just endured. Outside, the women gradually noticed the change, first by scent, then by burgeoning rumor. "They're baking again," whispered a tall brunette who had once worked in a celebrated pastry shop in Augsburg. "Not bread this time. Something sweet." A nurse, her sleeves rolled high from scrubbing latrines, scoffed dismissively. "Americans can't even make proper coffee. What do they know about pastry?" The others murmured agreement, but their tone carried more yearning than actual ridicule. Hunger was no longer simply for sustenance. It was for tangible proof that life could still possess a good, comforting taste. By noon, the entire camp had transformed, suspended in a strange blend of lingering suspicion and growing anticipation. Smoke billowed from the chimneys, thick with the unmistakable scent of butter and baked fruit, wrapping itself around the fences like an irresistible temptation. The guards exchanged light-hearted jokes, feigning ignorance of the way every prisoner's eyes followed the drifting, fragrant clouds. Hanley and his small team worked relentlessly inside, improvising with the available ingredients. Army-issue flour, canned apples from surplus rations, a precious pinch of nutmeg salvaged from a Red Cross crate. They lacked delicate puff pastry or the fine, rich German butter. Yet somehow, as the dough thinned beneath their rolling pins, the kitchen began to fill with a sense of something almost sacred. Private Reynolds leaned against the counter, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "You ever think it's strange, Sarge?" he mused. "Feeding the same folks who shot at us last year." Hanley paused, the whisk stilled in his hand. "Yeah," he said quietly, his gaze distant. "But maybe that's how we win for real." He didn't mean victory in the military sense. He meant something gentler, something far harder to achieve, the kind of victory that didn't fit on a medal. Through the kitchen window, Hanley could observe the German women gathered in small, tight knots near the fence, their faces pale, watchful, and intensely silent. They weren't shouting insults anymore. They were waiting. Some folded their arms, attempting to project indifference, while others subtly sniffed the air, as if it might betray a hidden secret. The sight of them stirred something uneasy within him, a dawning realization that nourishing the defeated demanded even greater courage than fighting them ever had. Mercy, he thought, was immeasurably heavier than any rifle. In the afternoon, a group of women was assigned the task of scrubbing the mess hall floors. Among them was the pastry worker from Augsburg. Her name, as Hanley would eventually learn, was Marta. She moved with quiet, practiced precision, eyes downcast, her hands raw and red from the relentless soap and cold water. When she heard the familiar clatter of the oven opening behind her, instinct made her glance back. For a fleeting heartbeat, her old life, vibrant and whole, returned to her. The warm, inviting smell of browning pastry, the soft, crisp crackle of buttered crust. She froze, then quickly looked away, acutely ashamed of her own sudden surge of nostalgia. The war had twisted memory into a form of betrayal. Hanley, observing her subtle hesitation, spoke without thinking, his voice gentle. "You've baked before, haven't you?" The words hung in the air like an unexpected challenge. Marta straightened slowly, not daring to meet his gaze. "Everyone in Germany has baked," she stated flatly, her accent clipped and imbued with a quiet pride. He nodded, almost smiling. "Then you'll know if we're doing it right." She shot him a quick, sharp glare, a complex mixture of being half insulted, half intrigued. It was the first truly honest look exchanged between them. That evening, as the sun bled shades of fiery orange behind the majestic Alps, the kitchen transformed into a small theater of both tension and creation. Dough was stretched so incredibly thin that light shimmered through it. Apples, tossed in syrup, gleamed like polished amber. Hanley worked in silence, occasionally glancing toward the window, acutely aware that the eyes outside were not merely observing food. They were witnessing dignity being painstakingly rewritten. The American camp had stripped these women of everything except one tenacious belief, that no one could bake like a German. Now, even that fundamental certainty trembled. When the strudels were finally pulled from the ovens, the soldiers stood back, an almost reverent silence settling over them. Steam rose from the trays like fragrant incense, carrying with it an aroma that belonged to no single flag. It was universal: warmth, sugar, and the potent evocation of memory. Peters crossed his arms and let out a soft, appreciative whistle. "Well, damn, Hanley. Smells like peace." Hanley chuckled, though a flicker of sadness touched his smile. "Peace," he murmured, his gaze distant. "Or surrender." Outside, the guards carried the trays toward the mess hall, the intoxicating aroma preceding them like a fragrant herald. The German women stood utterly still, their faces a complex mosaic of disbelief and pride thinly disguised as disdain. One muttered under her breath, "We'll see if they can even roll it right." Another whispered, "They'll drown it in sugar like everything else." But as the trays passed, even their mockery faltered. The strudels looked undeniably perfect. Thin, flaky layers folded with meticulous care, edges golden and crisp, the apple filling bubbling gently beneath the crust. Marta stared the longest, her gaze sharp and discerning. She could discern, even from a distance, that whoever had made them genuinely understood the craft. The precise fold lines, the subtle butter marks, the way the pastry had artfully breathed in the oven. It was no accidental success. She felt a sting she couldn't quite explain, as if her own deeply ingrained pride had been quietly and expertly matched. When the first tray finally reached the serving table, a profound silence enveloped the entire camp. Even the guards ceased their low conversations. For the prisoners, this was about something far deeper than just dessert. It was about who they were now and what they had irrevocably lost. Food, they suddenly realized, could inflict wounds as profound as bullets, especially when it came from the hands of an enemy who, inexplicably, did it better. Hanley watched from the kitchen doorway, flour still dusting his hands, as the first women hesitated before their plates. He could not discern their words, but he recognized the familiar look. Stubborn resistance gradually giving way to overwhelming hunger, pride bending under the sheer weight of simple human need. He turned back toward the ovens, uncertain whether he had just performed an act of mercy or one of subtle, exquisite cruelty. That night, as the camp lights dimmed and the ghost of apple scent lingered in the cool air, Marta lay awake, replaying the vivid sight of those American bakers. Their easy laughter, their surprising precision, their unsettling calm. For the very first time since her capture, she felt something wholly unexpected, a spark of intense curiosity. How could they, the victors, care so deeply about getting something so small, so intrinsically German, so perfectly right? She didn't yet know that soon she would find herself standing beside them, flour on her own hands, diligently learning the recipe she once vowed no foreigner could ever master. The morning after the strudels were baked, the camp awoke to a silence that felt heavier and more profound than frost. Even the usual coughs, the occasional shouts, and the clatter of boots seemed dulled, muted. Steam rose from the field kitchens, drifting lazily into the pale Bavarian sky, carrying with it that same maddening, irresistible scent: apple, butter, and something almost holy. For the German women, it was simultaneously a torment and an intoxicating temptation. They had spent years subsisting on bitterness. Now, sweetness threatened to utterly undo them. Marta stood in line, her hands folded tightly beneath her shawl. She hadn't truly slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that American baker, Hanley, bent over the dough with the unwavering focus of a true craftsman. She hated that image for its unexpected grace. She hated that she desperately wanted to see it again. Around her, the women whispered, their voices clipped and tense. "They'll feed it to the officers first. It's probably fake, just propaganda." But underneath the scorn, a palpable hunger crackled like static electricity. When the mess hall doors eventually opened, the intoxicating smell hit them with full force. The women hesitated, a collective intake of breath, then filed in with slow, deliberate steps. The light inside was dim, filtered through windows smeared with grease and frost. The long tables gleamed with tin trays, and at their very center waited the strudel. Rows of it still warm, still delicately steaming. Even in the starkness of defeat, beauty possessed a way of commanding profound silence. A corporal handed out portions with mechanical precision. One woman muttered, a bitter edge to her voice, "They think we'll forget everything for a piece of pastry." The soldier didn't respond. He simply placed a slice on her plate and moved on. When Marta's turn came, she eyed her portion with intense suspicion. The crust was impeccably golden, the filling a rich amber and glistening invitingly. She desperately wanted to reject it, to prove that pride could still fill a hollow stomach, but her hands, betraying her resolve, refused to obey. The first bite was cautious, almost defiantly slow. The pastry gave way with a soft, delicate crackle. The apples within were still perfectly tender beneath their sugared glaze. The taste was exquisitely balanced, neither too sweet nor too heavy, subtly brightened with lemon, and finished with the profound warmth of cinnamon. It was perfect, too perfect. Marta froze mid-bite, a tremor running through her. Around her, others were tasting, their faces subtly shifting through disbelief, resentment, and finally, a quiet, almost imperceptible surrender. No one spoke, but something fundamental inside the room profoundly changed. For months, their mouths had known only the acrid taste of fear. Now it was butter and fruit. It was memory. It was humiliation exquisitely wrapped in an act of unexpected mercy. Hanley stood by the doorway, watching the scene unfold. He didn't look triumphant. He looked thoughtful, even slightly troubled. When Sergeant Peters nudged him with an elbow and quipped, "Guess we converted him," Hanley only shook his head. "No," he murmured, his gaze distant. "Just reminded them they're human." At another table, one woman began to cry softly, almost soundlessly. She had once owned a beloved cafe in Munich, now reduced to smoking ash. The strudel tasted exactly like what her husband used to bring home on Sundays, before the blaring of the sirens. "It's the same," she whispered to herself, though in her heart, she knew it wasn't. It was better. That searing realization burned worse than any hunger. Across from her, a Red Cross volunteer discreetly slipped her an extra napkin and said nothing. Sometimes silence was the only form of grace left. By afternoon, the story had spread through every barracks. The American strudel had unequivocally outdone the German one. It became a phrase uttered half-jokingly, half in profound shame. "They even bake better than us now." The women argued tirelessly over how it could possibly be. Some claimed the American flour was inherently superior, lighter, richer. Others insisted the ovens burned hotter. Marta alone suspected the deeper truth, that it wasn't about ingredients at all. It was about care. The Americans, infuriatingly, had baked as if they genuinely believed the women deserved something good, something perfect. That night, Marta was assigned to help scrub the kitchen floor. She tried assiduously not to look at the gleaming counter where the pastries had cooled. But Hanley was there again, sleeves rolled, meticulously wiping down trays. He noticed her subtle glance and offered a faint, gentle smile. "Did you try it?" he asked. She stiffened perceptibly. "It was edible," she replied, her voice clipped. He grinned. "Edible's a start." She turned away, suddenly embarrassed by the unexpected warmth creeping into her cheeks. "You used too much sugar," she said sharply, a last-ditch effort at critical distance. "Ah," he replied, playfully pretending to take notes on an invisible pad. Expert feedback from the competition. Something in his easy, unpretentious tone disarmed her completely. No arrogance, no mockery, just a kind of quiet, respectful acknowledgement that confused her more profoundly than any cruelty ever could. For months, they had been rigorously trained to think of Americans as barbarians. Loud, uncultured, crude. Yet this one handled pastry with the delicate touch of a poet. She wondered if he had family, if he'd left someone waiting for him back home. She hated herself for even wondering. Over the next few days, more batches were baked, some for the guards, others increasingly for the prisoners. Eventually, a few of the German women were permitted to assist in the kitchen, under careful supervision. Marta volunteered, though she couldn't quite articulate why. The first time she stepped inside, the palpable warmth hit her like a comforting wave. Hanley handed her a rolling pin. "Think you can handle this?" he asked, a hint of challenge in his voice. She met his gaze squarely. "I was baking before you were born." Working beside him, she found herself falling effortlessly into old, familiar rhythms. The yielding dough under her palms, the faint creak of the wooden table, the soft hum of quiet conversation. It all felt impossibly normal, disarmingly so. Hanley whistled softly as he worked, some American tune she didn't recognize. When he caught her listening, he stopped. "Sorry, habit." She shrugged, a slight, almost imperceptible gesture. "It's better than the shouting." That made him smile again, the kind of smile that didn't feel like victory, just shared acknowledgement. One afternoon, she showed him how to stretch the dough even thinner, lifting it gently until the light shone through like fine parchment. "It must breathe," she explained, her voice soft but authoritative. "Otherwise, it dies in the oven." Hanley nodded, repeating the motion carefully, committing it to memory. "Let it breathe," he murmured under his breath. The moment felt strangely intimate, two erstwhile enemies unexpectedly united by pastry, bound not by the harsh dictates of politics, but by the universal language of craft. Outside, the war's ruins still emitted faint smoke. Train tracks twisted grotesquely through desolate fields. Children scavenged desperately for coal, and the churches stood roofless, gaunt against the gray skies. Yet inside that kitchen, something fragile and profoundly forbidden began to grow. The quiet awareness that humanity, against all odds, had survived the wreckage. For Marta, it was unbearable and beautiful all at once. A week later, as rations subtly improved and the pervasive tension eased, Hanley surprised the women with another dessert. Small pies, exquisitely shaped like hearts. "American tradition," he explained, smiling sheepishly. "Valentine's Day." The women exchanged confused glances, utterly unfamiliar with what Valentine's Day entailed. But when they bit into the pie's simple crust, soft, sweet fruit filling, they laughed. Real laughter, uninhibited and unguarded, echoing across the mess hall like the welcome return of spring. For the first time, the guards did not hush them. That evening, Marta found herself writing again in her confiscated diary, the same one she'd meticulously hidden in her shoe. Her words emerged slowly, uncertainly. "I thought mercy was weakness. I thought sweetness was for the naive. But today I saw men make art from flour and fire, and I felt something break inside me, not in pain but in recognition." She paused, then added one final, poignant line. "Perhaps defeat is just the beginning of honesty." When Hanley saw her leaving later, he called out softly, "Tomorrow, we try it your way." She turned, a puzzled expression on her face. "My way? The real German recipe," he clarified. "No shortcuts." She looked at him for a long, searching moment, then finally nodded. "All right," she said quietly. "But you'll need patience." Hanley smiled. "After this war, patience is all I've got left." The ovens behind them glowed like small, comforting suns, and for the first time in months, neither victory nor defeat seemed to matter. Only what could be meticulously made with steady hands and the fragile promise of forgiveness. By late spring of 1946, the fences around the camp no longer seemed like confining cages, but merely boundaries patiently waiting to be forgotten. The war's thunder had long since fallen silent, leaving behind only the steady, industrious hum of rebuilding. Villages were meticulously sprouting new roofs. Trains were running once more, and even the desolate ruins had begun to bloom with tenacious weeds and resilient wildflowers. But inside that American camp, the strangest and most profound reconstruction of all was quietly underway, not of buildings or political ideologies, but of people. Every morning, the ovens ignited before the sun did, and the comforting scent of pastry drifted out like a flag no single nation could claim. Marta now worked seamlessly beside Hanley, her hair neatly tied back with a faded ribbon, the rhythm of her hands as certain and natural as breath itself. She no longer scrubbed floors. She baked. The soldiers still affectionately called her Fräulein Strudel, a nickname that had started as an innocent joke and evolved into a cherished title. She never corrected them. Each careful fold of dough felt like a delicate stitching together of two worlds, one that had burned in the fires of conflict, and another that was slowly, tentatively learning to forgive. Hanley, for his part, had also undergone a quiet transformation. The sharp, rigid edges of his soldier's posture had softened. His laughter came more easily, though sometimes, when he believed no one was observing, his eyes carried that haunted, faraway look, the kind men wore when they had witnessed far too much. He often confided that baking helped to quiet the incessant noise that lingered in his head. "I figure," he once told Marta, his voice thoughtful, "if you can make something sweet after everything turns bitter, maybe that's what winning really means." She offered no verbal answer, but her eloquent silence conveyed her profound agreement. The camp commander, Colonel Whitman, paid a visit one afternoon, inspecting the kitchen with the keen eye of a general surveying a battlefield. "Smells like victory," he remarked dryly, watching Hanley expertly pull a tray from the oven. Marta straightened immediately at the sound of his voice, once again uneasy under the weight of authority. But Whitman surprised her. "You," he said, gesturing toward her with a half-smile. "They say your strudel could start another peace conference." The room chuckled softly, but there was an undeniable kernel of truth in his tone. Food, in that remarkable place, had transcended its simple purpose, becoming something profoundly political, an unspoken treaty between conqueror and conquered. When a Red Cross representative arrived weeks later, she proposed something utterly unheard of: an exchange. American cooks would willingly share their recipes with local German women, and in return, the women would graciously teach their traditional dishes. A culinary armistice, she called it. The idea spread through the camp faster than any rumor. Some soldiers joked that diplomacy by dessert might achieve what treaties never could. Others were unsure if it was truly right to break bread so intimately with former enemies. But Hanley said quietly, with unwavering conviction, "You can't stay enemies when you've shared an oven." The first joint baking day was, as expected, rather awkward. German women arrived from nearby villages wearing patched dresses and expressions that were guarded, wary. The Americans, their aprons tied and sleeves rolled, tried their best to appear less like soldiers and more like welcoming hosts. Marta and Hanley led the session together, a study in quiet collaboration. They stood side by side at the long wooden table, demonstrating with patient precision how to roll the dough exquisitely thin, how to brush it delicately with melted butter, how to fold it just so, ensuring the layers would puff instead of break. Marta demonstrated with her usual, exacting precision. Hanley followed, mimicking her gestures until she offered a subtle nod of approval. Slowly, tentatively at first, then louder, warmer, laughter began to ripple through the room. Someone began humming a simple folk tune, and soon, voices from both sides joined in, creating a shared, harmonious sound. When the strudels were finally done, they lined them up along the counter like precious trophies of peace, each one slightly different, some more golden, some more rustic, but all, without exception, beautiful. The rich, sweet smell filled the room, mingling with the sound of laughter and the gentle clinking of utensils. A soldier snapped a photograph. Flour-dusting faces, smiles crooked and genuine, hands covered in white. Years later, historians would discover that photograph and fittingly dub it the strudel truce. For Marta, it was the first day she no longer felt intrinsically like a prisoner. She realized, with a profound sense of relief, that she had stopped flinching whenever someone uttered the word American. For Hanley, it was the day he finally understood that the war had not truly ended with signed surrender papers, but with forgiveness meticulously written in crumbs and echoing laughter. That summer, as demobilization orders began to come through, the camp slowly started to empty. Soldiers packed their belongings, fences were dismantled, and the kitchen, once bustling, fell quiet. On Hanley's last morning, he found Marta already there, kneading dough with focused intensity. She didn't look up when she said, her voice soft, "You're leaving." He nodded, resting his flour-dusted hands on the sturdy table. "They're sending me home," he said softly. "Back to Chicago. My father's bakery's still standing. Needs help." She pressed her palms into the dough harder than strictly necessary. "Then you'll make strudel there," she said, her voice betraying a hint of something unsaid. He smiled faintly. "Only if you send me the recipe." For a moment, neither spoke. The ovens clicked softly as they cooled. Then Marta reached for a small scrap of paper from her apron pocket. A handwritten recipe, the ink smudged and gracefully stained with flour. She placed it carefully on the table between them. "It's not just the ingredients," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his. "It's how you feel when you make it. If you rush, it dies." He folded the precious note carefully, tucking it into his breast pocket like something sacred. "I won't rush," he promised, his voice low and sincere. When the trucks came that afternoon, the remaining prisoners gathered to watch the soldiers depart. Some waved shyly, others stood perfectly still, uncertain whether an expression of gratitude was even permitted. Hanley climbed aboard, turning once more to find Marta in the dispersing crowd. She was standing near the gate, flour still subtly streaked on her cheek. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment, it felt like an ending far too simple for its profound meaning. He raised a hand in a final salute. She lifted hers in return, a silent gesture of farewell. Then the truck rolled away, leaving behind only swirling dust and the faint, lingering smell of apples. Years passed. Germany painstakingly rebuilt itself, and so, too, did the fractured world. Cities rose from the rubble, and peace, in its own strange and often unexpected forms, gradually found its footing. In Chicago, the Hanley Bakery became renowned for something it had never sold before the war: its exquisite apple strudel. Customers traveled from miles away, drawn by its perfect balance of sweetness and spice, a taste that lingered long after the last bite. When asked about the secret to the recipe, James Hanley would simply smile and say, "An old friend taught me. Best teacher I ever had." Meanwhile, in a quiet village near Garmisch, an older woman baked on Sundays for her beloved grandchildren. Her hands were slower now, her hair elegantly streaked with silver, but her meticulous precision remained undiminished. She recounted stories to the children as she worked. Stories of a terrible war, a strange camp, and a man who had learned to bake like a German, but smiled like an American. The little ones laughed, certain she was merely inventing delightful tales. "No," she would say softly, her eyes glimmering with a distant memory. "Sometimes, peace truly begins with dessert." One day, she found a mysterious envelope in her postbox. Inside was a photograph, black and white, its edges softly faded with time. It depicted a bakery window in Chicago, the sign above it proudly reading Hanley and Son. Behind the gleaming glass, trays of strudel shone like pure gold. At the bottom of the photo, written in neat, familiar handwriting, were the simple, poignant words, "Still not rushing." She pressed the photograph to her chest, her eyes stinging with unexpected tears. The war had brutally stripped away everything that had once defined her. Yet, through a single, shared act of creation, she had reclaimed something far greater than victory: connection. That night, she lit a candle and reverently placed the photograph beside it. The comforting scent of warm apples filled her kitchen once more, mingling softly with the gentle sound of rain outside. As the first strudel began to brown in the oven, she whispered, almost to herself, "You baked it better. I'll admit it." Then she smiled through the quiet ache, a bittersweet acknowledgement. "But I taught you how." And across an entire ocean, though she would never know it. Another oven flickered to life. The same recipe, the same soothing rhythm, the same fragile, enduring miracle. Sometimes wars end not with signatures or grand speeches, but with the simple, profound mercy of two people sharing what they had learned, one crumb at a time.